Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show, bringing you another really fascinating guest today, helping to create a better tomorrow on some really unique fronts. Today, we have the honor of being joined by Brett Anderson, who is both a clinical social worker and a gerontologist on a mission to ultimately rethink aging, healthy longevity, mental health. And for those of you that follow the world of rock and roll, specifically from the early 1990s into the mid 2010s, you will no doubt probably recognize Ms. Anderson as also the former lead singer of the rock and roll group the Donnas, where for 20 years she was the lead vocalist, performing all over the United States as well as internationally. They had performances on media like Saturday Night Live, David Letterman's show, Late Night with Conan O'Brien. Ms. Anderson studied psychology undergrad at Stanford University, where she did her honors thesis in the area of temporal discounting across lifespan. Then she went on to do both a master's work in gerontology that at USC Leonard Davis School of Gerontology, and a master's in social work from UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. She is now, actively involved in a career as a licensed geriatric social worker. Ultimately, she hopes to integrate both her creative and her business expertise with gerontological knowledge, ultimately to meet the needs of the rapidly aging population. We're honored to have her with us today. Brett Anderson, welcome to our show. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating set of topics I'm looking forward to getting into today with you. I would love to start out as you typically do, really handing things over to you for a little bit, just to talk a little bit about your journey that got you where you are today and what you're doing. If you could take us back to sort of the beginning of your music career. I know that, that was your early teens, but a little bit of that whole evolution of those couple decades of your life, and then a little bit of what got you interested in this sort of three-way, of psychology, gerontology, and mental health. Take us a little on the journey and take your time with that, because I know it's a long story.
It is. It's funny. I'm 43 now, and I feel like my life story is getting just longer and longer, but I think that's a good thing. I'll start out by saying I grew up in Indiana, Midwestern, and moved to California when I was 12 during the .com era. So, I kind of was immersed in that startup mentality and just like, anything can happen in a garage in Palo Alto, basically. Which is funny enough, where my band started in a garage in Palo Alto. We just, would walk home from school and practice every day. And then it just slowly grew into a real career in music, which is, I think, more than, anyone can really expect when you start a band when you're 13. And I think part of the reason that it worked so well is because we didn't have expectations to grow to the size that we grew to. We were just doing it because we loved it. And I think we just really appreciated every step of the way. So that kind of happened in middle school, carried on through high school. We were lucky enough to be able to go to Japan when we were still in high school, which is super exciting. I loved it so much. I saved, the wrappers from everything that I got. So it was, it was like saving the garbage, but that's just how much we love the culture and everything there and the design. And And then I was able to go on tour around the country when I was about 18. We thought maybe it was just going to take 6 weeks. We went to a semester of college. I went to Berkeley for just one semester when I was 18 in 1997. And, took a little break to go on this tour. And then it just ended up lasting for 15 years. We were touring around the United States and Europe and Japan and Australia. And it was just an amazing way to see the world and to meet people who are, similar in taste and moral outlook and all that stuff, instead of just sort of like seeing other tourists. And I think by experiencing the world through music like that, I just got to see a lot of examples of, what it looks like to thrive and what it looks like to age really well and what it looks like to kind of burn out early. I also saw some really great examples of people struggling with mental health issues. I think creativity is a really great outlet, but when you make it your profession and, you take your passion and you make it into your job, sometimes that can really put a lot of pressure on you to be creative. And I think a lot of people get sort of stuck in a position where they think, they need substances to be creative, and they, if their use gets out of control, that they will never be able to be creative again if they, have to be sober or whatever. So I saw a lot of that. And just a lot of people I felt like were struggling for unnecessary reasons. We also dealt with a lot of gendered ageism in the music industry. We would do a lot of interviews, and just, every day when we walked into the club, it was just, we were immediately always met with like skepticism and doubt, that we were going to be able to play our instruments and handle the stage. And, we won people over one by one, but it was just, that got kind of old after a while too, because, it was the 90s and the early 2000s. We felt like we should be beyond that. So I think between all of those things and just looking at how, people struggling with internal limitations, people struggling with external limitations, and how all those things come together, it just made me interested in psychology to begin with, how we deal with all those things, and then psychology's place within a society. So that's why I ended up studying social work, because there's like that concept of the person in environment, and we always think of people within the environment that they exist, because no one lives in a vacuum.
Right.
And then my personal interest in aging, I always am kind of trying to figure out where that came from. I think part of it was because my mom was a nurse practitioner at the VA for about 20 years. So,
Okay.
I learned a lot from her. And then just, I don't know, kind of dealing with like being off with like, the social clock is like what we're supposed to be doing at certain times in our lives. And I was always, ahead. And then later on, I was behind. And so when you're not on the social clock, you see what a construct it is,
Mm-hmm.
and how people sort of tie themselves to it unnecessarily. So I think that's kind of how I came to where I am today and where my interests are applying.
Awesome. Awesome. And I was looking at in the intro. I was looking through some of the things that you've done as you were studying early for your bachelor's, and I really read that you worked with Dr. Laura Carstensen at Stanford. She was the founding director of the Stanford Center on Longevity, and you did this work during your undergrad in sort of this area of what was called time discounting or temporal discounting. And you'll explain it better than me, but sort of this general concept that as we age, although there's these things that we should be learning or these new activities, we tend to put more sort of focus on the shorter term, although we know that these other things, whether it's new skills or capabilities, would it improve us, we tend not to do that, to get involved with them, and that sort of impacts where we're engaged and so forth as we age. Talk a little bit about sort of this component of your education in terms of the psychology of longevity.
Sure, yeah. Well, just to start, I mean, I was just focusing on psychology at Stanford because I know that they're known for that, and it was just a really good, if you could be anywhere in the world and study a subject, that's where I would be. And then I took a class on longevity from Laura Carstensen, and it, every class was a different topic. She had a lot of really amazing guest speakers, and it was so enlightening just to see all the challenges that we're dealing with now and that are coming up because of things like Social Security solvency and, challenges that we don't really have solutions to yet. So I just felt like, what could be more important than understanding where we're at right now and how to potentially prepare for the future? So a lot of her research focuses on socio-emotional selectivity theory, which is like the idea, well, it kind of involves a lot of things, but it's like your future time perspective, which is whether you are looking at the future or judging by how much time you have left versus how much time you've been here, basically. When we're focusing on like a limited future time perspective, we tend to focus on spending time on emotionally meaningful activities with people that mean a lot to us. And when we're focusing on an expanded future time perspective, we tend to focus on things that will prepare us for the future. It's kind of intuitive, but what she did was operationalize it and make it something that we could refer back to in other projects. And her work is cited in a lot of amazing studies. And then what I brought into that was the temporal discounting aspect, because I read a lot of interesting research on people and how they relate to their future selves. So I think there's some studies about language and future languages versus present languages. So like in English, we talk about like, tomorrow I will be going over here, as opposed to in other languages, they say, I go over here now, or I go over here tomorrow, but the verb tense is always the same. And what they found was that in future languages, like English, we think of our future selves as different people, basically. And so we tend to prioritize our needs in the present tense, as opposed to like, hey, I'm going to need this later, So a lot of the research on temporal discounting was done on smoking cessation and, people needing like a small boost in the moment versus like potentially a longer life in the long run. And I just wanted to apply that to how we spend our time and see if that was something that came up in basically time use.
Excellent. And then as you moved into your work, both social work and gerontology now, you focused on a variety of really interesting themes, and I'd just like to go into each of these because I think they're each extremely important in their own right. One of these had to do with substance use disorders in the elderly, something maybe we might not think as much about. I think a lot of us have experience with this that we don't normally talk about. My mother was a case example of this, may she rest in peace. But back in the day, there was a period where the benzodiazepines came on the scene. I think this was like in the 1960s, and there are these new safe, sleeping aids, and we forget about the barbiturates. They're bad for us. Here's the benzos, and they're not bad. And she developed an addiction until almost the time she got 90. And it was just a, thing of embarrassment for her that she just couldn't remove herself from this. She needed this to fall asleep. And if she tried not to take it, a withdrawal worse than any opiate, anything you can think of. Talk a little bit about this topic, because I think it's something we don't think as much about, but it is sort of maybe an underappreciated component of the sort of substance use disorder space that we should spend a little more time of, especially in the sort of the gerontological world.
Sure. Yeah. I want to set a disclaimer, first of all, because I think sometimes people have a tendency to think of like, and I like to use person first language, which is something that that was also enlightening to me, to, instead of saying like an addict or something, it's like a person who's living with an addiction. Right. Yep. And I think that makes a huge difference, the language that we use.
Absolutely.
So one thing is like, I think people put people with addictions into different categories a lot. And I like to push back on that. So when this whole opioid epidemic happened, there was like a tendency for people to say, that's not just some like person living under a bridge. That's someone's daughter, that's someone's sister, and I just want to point out that everyone who's dealing with an addiction is someone's son or daughter, like we are all people that start from a place and end up in another place, and due to circumstances, and we're all eligible for that. But that being said, I think that this instance of addiction in older, like later life, I think is really interesting to look at, because it does have a lot of differences from addiction in earlier life. And I think one of them is just polypharmacy to begin with. I think there's something called the cascade effect, where you're prescribed something for a condition to treat the symptoms, but then it has side effects. So then you're prescribed something else to treat the side effects of the thing you're prescribed to treat the symptoms. And then it just cascades down to now you have all these different prescriptions, and, you know, they all interact with each other. And because our health system is so convoluted, doctors and physicians and specialists aren't always communicating with each other as well as they should be. And so people can end up on really strange cocktails of things, you know, that maybe don't go very well together. And some of those might be, you know, things that are really addictive. And I think that, you know, during the beginning of the opioid epidemic, people were just prescribing like nobody's business. And there was sort of a myth that if it was prescribed, it wasn't addictive, which if you think about that makes zero sense, you know. But it just speaks to sort of like the stigma that's tied to over-the-counter drugs versus, you know, more illicit like street drugs. And so finally, we've kind of picked up on the fact that like things are addictive because of their chemical qualities, you know, and doesn't really matter where they came from. And I think the thing that's interesting about addictions in later life is that a lot of addiction and recovery has to do with identity. So you think about like, I've made it through my whole career, you know, through maybe even early retirement without having to confront this identity as like an addict or someone who's dealing with an addiction. And I think it could be really hard for people to understand or accept or just deal with that kind of like new label. And yeah, there's something that happens too with diagnoses where sometimes it can feel like a sentence, like a death sentence, but sometimes it can feel like a relief because now you have a word for this thing you've been dealing with, and now you can relate to other people who are dealing with the same thing.
Gotcha. But I noticed that last month at USC, as part of the International Day of Older Persons event, there was a session or a speaker's focus on women and resilience, and you gave a talk on the topic of your talk was applied resilience in the life course. And I think that this theme of resilience, it's sort of we've been mentioned it on other shows, and I think we might not focus on it as much as we should. But just, you know, I think of resilience in sort of generic terms as sort of the ability to bounce back from something, whether that's an injury, whether that's grief, whatever it may be, more effectively than previously. And it's sort of a separate area from, say, biologic fitness or something of that nature. Talk a little bit about what applied resilience is in the world of your world of gerontology, because I know you focus on a lot more than just sort of interventions in terms of, say, therapeutic interventions, but a lot of the different areas you touch on in terms of, I know you're involved in palliative care, social isolation problems, things of this nature as well that we don't normally get into, but major parts of sort of the elderly community that need to be dealt with through interventions. Talk a little about resilience, if you would, and applied resilience.
Sure. I mean, I feel like I keep starting with disclaimers, but all these terms, you know,
Please.
come along with these disclaimers. So resilience is something that I've always felt really passionate about. Part of the reason I was interested is because I transferred from a community college to a 4-year university, and my cohort of transfer students was super interesting, and everyone had, you know, bounced back from one or many challenges. And so I just felt really inspired by their experiences, and we started a project, you know, to help people tell their stories about that and be inspired by each other's stories. But the flip side of resilience is that I think sometimes the word gets used as almost like an expectation for people to pick themselves up by their bootstraps, which is a very, you know, United Statesian idea. Like we're all so independent, you know, and people have growing resentments against this term resilience because it's sort of used as a way to say like, you should be taking care of yourself. And the point that I made in the talk at USC was that resilience has a lot to do with the people around you. I told a story about one of the people who was at the internship that I did at Motion Picture Television Fund, who was the oldest person there and sat at the front desk every day. And I think, you know, that was a big component of why she was able to stay engaged and plugged in and feel supported, because I think there's that feeling of giving back. It wasn't that she was just like a receiver of help. She was also contributing. And I think as people, we really need to feel like that. And, you know, she would answer the phones and interact with all the nurses, and it made everyone feel good. And it slowed people down a little bit, but to give them credit, like they saw how much it really helped her feel like she was connected and part of the flow of life, instead of sort of like on the side and just receiving help.
What in terms of the age-related biases, you talk of, I've seen you write about sort of this theme, and obviously this is a focus of your practice and so forth that you're developing. But you've written about some of these common misperceptions about aging, that old people might be resistant to wanting help, or not interested in certain things, whether it's current events, sexual intimacy, what have you. Any other misperceptions that are out there that you want to dispose of, or surprising things that you learn as you study both social work and gerontology, that we might not normally think of when it comes to this population? Any surprises, interesting fun facts, or stories along those lines you could share?
Yeah. Well, one thing that I've just seen that's been really inspiring is like all the different options for intergenerational living.
Yeah.
So I think, when we get people together, and like a lot of stereotypes and stigma are deconstructed by exposure. So the more familiarity a person has, and the more someone has like a specific example of one older person that they know, instead of just older people as a group, I think that really helps us break down stereotypes. So there's a place, I don't think it's active anymore, but it's called Judson Manor, where it was a senior living facility across the street from a music school. And they started this fellowship where people would come in and they'd live either together, I can't remember if it was together or just next door to the people that were living in the facility. And they would do these sort of performances, and it would pay for their rent. And so it was just like a win-win situation. And these interactions between people made everyone feel like connected and just a lot better about their situation. So there are just things like that are happening. There's sort of like the village movement as well, where people are kind of gathering together, and instead of living in facilities, they're sort of taking care of each other in a more holistic way, and in a more independent way. And then there's just the idea too, like of the language that we use. I think for me, that's been really surprising. There are a lot of interesting things I see pop up on Twitter a lot. I think it's called Engaging Aging, where they have examples of language that we're using that is pretty detrimental. And I think, even just the word elderly, I mean, a lot of things like connote a decline in functionality. And a generalization of a whole group of people. So I think that paying attention to the words we're using is really important.
What when it comes to as I mentioned, so we talked about some of these issues. You're involved in a rather wide range of focuses in terms of the therapeutic interventions for whether it be chronic conditions, the social isolation, palliative care, what have you. We touch a lot on themes on the show like age tech and some of these new technologies that are coming along, whether they're the wearables or things with our smartphones or smart homes and so forth, gone in a bunch of different directions. As you've been working in this space, what excites you in terms of some of these new tools that are coming down the pipeline, specifically for sort of the age tech space and applications in gerontology?
Yeah, I think there's some really great stuff happening with universal design, where people are sort of building in more functionality into homes and making them accessible ahead of time. So I know a lot of my neighbors where I'm living now are, when they remodel, they make the doorways wider and they make the bathrooms more accessible. And they don't need it at this point in time, but they know that they might in the future, and that, when they sell their house, that someone might benefit from that as well. Part of that is making it visually appealing, which might not seem like that big of a deal, but I think that affects, our well-being, our sense of self, whether we think of ourselves as patients or frail, or whether we think of ourselves as people who are being resourceful and adapting our environments to our needs. So I think there's a lot of really cool stuff happening with universal design. Like I've seen even people designing canes and walkers that don't look like these typical canes and
Right.
walkers that we've seen, you know, with the
Yep.
tennis balls and everything. So I think that can make a really big difference. I think sometimes there is a little bit of a backfire when we get into things like hacking aging or anti-aging,
Mhm.
you know, because it's like, it's funny, like when, you know, people know that I'm interested in aging and I'll talk to people and it's like in the first 10 minutes, you sort of are sussing out like, are we interested in aging well, or are we interested in living forever? Because
Right.
I'm not in that camp,
Right.
you know, for every reason, you know, psychological, sociological, economic, like all the reasons. Like I do not want people to live forever. We talk about the, what is it, the curve of morbidity,
Mhm.
which is
Mhm.
basically the idea that instead of hitting a decline when you're 60 and slowly declining until you die around 80, it's like you live fully until, you know, sort of ideally one day you just drop dead instantly and
Right.
painlessly.
Right.
And, you know, for me, that's like kind of how I want to go. Yeah. So I definitely am not in the aging, living forever camp. And the idea that we would, you know, want to not age is a little bit weird to me. Like we're aging. We're aging during this conversation, and
Sure.
that's fine. You know, the idea I think is just to maximize and optimize the way that we do that, so that we can do the things that matter to us while we're
Yeah.
here on this earth.
Yeah. It's interesting to bring that because we do a lot of shows on sort of that area as well in terms of longevity biotechnology and it's funny because we come to these topics of things like health span, right? Then I'll I have my in-laws that are close to 90 now, and I'll talk to them about so you wish you could be a little healthier. When you're 89 compared to you feel like you're 86, and they stare at me like no. I wish you would have done something like 30 years before for me, but that's a different topic. Um,
Right.
but but going from sort of the so this age tech discussion, the devices, and obviously the as you were just mentioning, sort of make things better in the home. I also read along the lines as you were going through these different programs, you had some exposure because you're in California, some exposure to the California health. I'm drawing a blank here, and the master plan in California
Oh
for
yeah.
aging and sort of the general age-friendly society concepts and so forth. Just say a few words about that, if you would, and sort of how gerontologist and some of the work you're doing fits into that, what you look for, and what does an age-friendly, in your case California, potentially look like? What things you're interested in that particular domain coming down the line?
Sure. Yeah. I think actually the timing of going back to school is probably a huge part of why I ended up studying aging, because the master plan for aging has been
Got it.
coming together, you know, while I've been in school. Even, you know, in 2016, the End of Life Option Act was, you know, came
Yep.
into being. So that was one of the reasons why I focused a lot of my papers on that option, you know, end of life
Mm-hmm.
care option. And so I think policy has obviously a huge effect on the way that we age. And I think policy is going to be the biggest thing that determines whether our societies are age friendly or not. When it comes to what we're going to do about Social Security, to basically how we're developing our communities. So, you know, there's a lot of need for housing for older adults.
Yep.
There's a lot of need for just basic needs to be covered. And the systems that we've used in the past have been great in a lot of ways, but I think with the population aging and the proportion and number of older adults growing, we're going to have to think of some new ways to deal with the increasing needs for housing and basic needs.
Excellent. Um, Brett, looping back to your beginnings, in the world of music and rock and roll and so forth, obviously music it plays a very important role in all our lives. And, there's all these very interesting, things you pick up in the scientific literature in terms of, in dementia patients, while they may forget how to do certain things, they don't forget music comparatively. I mean, I'm butchering this a bit because I haven't done the deep dive into all this, but the music holds a very unique place, not just from the perspective of our mind, but also the way it makes us feel and memories and just our entire sort of life course. Any interesting music related interventions, strategies in terms of the gerontology space that you, because I know, one of the things that you mentioned in your bio was sort of, you mentioned how you ultimately sort of want to reconnect sort of the creative part of everything you've been involved in with this sort of these new initiatives. Anything interesting on the music front you want to mention?
Sure, yeah. I think I'm drawing a blank on the name of the documentary, but there was a clip that people watched a lot of, a person who's living in a senior living facility and totally non-responsive, and then they put headphones on him and he just comes to life and
Right.
he starts, singing along, and just his eyes light up, and that's like one of those things that we show on the first day of many gerontology classes, because it's like a sort of hook that draws you in. So I know that can play a big role in the connection that people have. But also I think people, like what's happening right now with that is there are a couple apps that have been developed that will sort of tap into like a person's age and generation and the music that they listen to, and they put playlists together that will help either energize people or relax people, or help them tap into nostalgia in a way that could be really soothing. So I think that's kind of a really cool tool that people are putting together to, I think caregiving is one of the hardest things that's happening in our society right now. I think it's like completely overlooked. People aren't prepared for it. They don't realize that it's going to happen to them until it happens. And then, it takes people a while to find resources. And I think these little simple things can be really helpful when, say that your mother-in-law or someone that you don't know that well necessarily, like you end up in a position where you're taking care of them. Anything really that can help make that a smoother transition, I think, is a really welcome development.
Outstanding. But what's next? I mean, you've been on this amazing journey in entertainment and music, now in social work and gerontology. You're starting your practice off, following all the schooling you've been through. But what's happening next? What should we be on the outlook for in terms of continuing to follow you? Things coming up in 2023. Anything else that I missed as I was doing the research on you? Please, take some time, take the floor.
Well, I mean, sure, yeah, quite the contrary. I mean, the way that you're speaking about me makes it sound like I'm like already a professional, and I actually just graduated in May, so I'm just beginning my professional career in social work and gerontology. But yeah, the job search has been really interesting. I think one thing that's really cool about social work and gerontology is that the field is so wide. So you can work in a hospital, you can work in homes, you can work in policy, you can anywhere from macro to micro work, direct one-on-one stuff to policy. So one of my internships that I did was at Archstone Foundation, where, they basically delegate grant money to different organizations. And that was such a cool experience because I got to see who are the actors in the community right now and who's doing really great stuff, and just kind of get a lay of the land. And then I've also been looking into, pursuing my license as a LCSW, licensed clinical social worker. And so for me, that will be, in order to get those supervised hours, it'll be more direct work, things that are like more one-on-one. And so I've been looking towards palliative care, because I think that's a really interesting area. I don't know if you've touched on this in your show, but like the difference and overlap between palliative care and hospice care.
No.
The idea that...
Take us into that, if you would, for a couple minutes.
Sure, yeah. So hospice, we know, like, you have to have a prognosis of 6 months or less to live.
Okay.
One interesting fact that I learned recently about hospice care is the average length that most people are in hospice care is 18 days. And so if the window that we are working with is 6 months, but most people don't commit, not commit, but most people don't enter hospice until, 18 days until their life ultimately ends. I think that's showing that that's a resource that's really underused.
Got it.
So that's a potential for, people to look to those resources. And I think that part of the reason is because you think that people are going to give up on you, because now you've said, okay, I'm not going to accept any more curative care. Basically, everything that we're doing now is to address symptoms and assuage symptoms. The cool thing about palliative care is that the short version is any age, any stage. So it's the idea is that you can anyone at any age can have palliative care. At any stage of a disease, you can have palliative care. But the idea is that you're treating symptoms and you're creating a more comfortable life for people. So it's not necessarily curative. It's more like, what can we do to lessen your suffering, and across the board, like the thing I've been interested in is where can we work on unnecessary suffering? Because, there's that saying that like pain is inevitable, but suffering is, when we add our own kind of meaning and resistance to pain.
Yep.
And I think, obviously pain is something that we're going to deal with in life. And, sometimes it's a good thing. It's like a signal that we need to change something, but there's pain that's unnecessary and it's avoidable. And so I think focusing my time and energy on ways to reduce that in people, I think for me seems like one of the best uses of my time I can imagine.
That's really outstanding. Now, I neglected to bring that up. I've read about sort of your work in that area as well, and I appreciate you talking about that because like some of these other areas, it is very underappreciated. And I mean, it's a fascinating set of sort of portfolio options out there for you, and I'm just I look forward to continuing to sort of follow where you go with all this, because it is just such an opportune time, and we have population's aging. It's a growing population, and there's just so many of these unmet areas that I think we can create better solutions for. So I'm glad you're doing it. I'm glad you're starting off at this time to address a lot of these. Again, for everybody that's going to be listening to this particular episode of the show across the various podcast networks or watching on our YouTube channel. Again, you've been listening to Brett Anderson, clinical social worker, gerontologist, on a mission to rethink aging, longevity, mental health. Obviously, check out her music from the 20 years prior when she was the lead singer of the Donnas. We will put her in the bio, her social links as well. Brett, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come talk to us for a little while about everything you're doing and the story behind this. Obviously, wishing you the best as you begin this stage of your career. And as we like to say on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow for so many people out there via what you're going to be doing. It's just a really impressive story, and I really appreciate you sharing it with us.
Thank you. And I feel just really honored to be included in the group of people that you've interviewed so far. I mean, you've done some really amazing interviews with people that I think are super interesting. So thanks for that. And thanks for the work that you're doing.
Great having you.